The Second World War has become, in our public memory, a contest between two immense powers. In the West, it is often framed as the triumph of American industry, the arsenal of democracy, the endless conveyor belt of liberty ships, aircraft, and tanks. In the East, it is framed as the triumph of Soviet sacrifice, the Great Patriotic War, won, so the story goes, by manpower and the unrelenting grind of the Eastern Front. Both narratives contain truth. American production mattered. Soviet endurance mattered. The Allied victory in 1945 was exactly that, an Allied victory. But these narratives also bypass a critical truth that is uncomfortable precisely because it does not fit neatly into either superpower's origin story. For 820 days, the survival of the democratic world, the survival of any future Allied coalition at all, rested on a single island and its global commonwealth, not as a romantic symbol, not as a noble underdog, but as the operational hinge of the war, the bridgehead, the intelligence engine, the logistical network, the research laboratory, the training ground, and, most importantly, the system that remained intact when much of Europe had fallen. This is not a story built on nationalistic slogans. It is a factual reappraisal. It is about the mechanics of survival and about why the world came to forget them. Because Britain's central contribution to victory was not always cinematic. It was often technical. It was often administrative. It was often invisible. And in the second half of the 20th century, the invisible rarely survives the competition of myths. That leaves a simple question. How did a nation that fought from day one, built the systems that defeated the Luftwaffe, kept the Atlantic lifeline open, broke the enemy's codes, innovated at a world-changing scale, fielded a global volunteer coalition, and provided the strategic architecture of D-Day, how did that nation become, in the popular imagination, a junior partner? The answer begins in September 1939. When Neville Chamberlain announced a state of war on the 3rd of September 1939, Britain was not entering a conflict it was prepared for. It was entering a conflict it was committed to, for the long haul. And even before the armies truly collided in Western Europe, the shape of the war was already revealing itself. While the so-called phony war unfolded on land, the Royal Navy was engaged in a real war at sea. Within hours of the declaration, the passenger liner SS Athenia was sunk by a German U-boat. It was an early warning of what the conflict would become, a war in which the fate of nations would be decided by supply lines, tonnage, and attrition, as much as by the movement of divisions. Then, in May 1940, the geopolitical situation collapsed. The fall of France was not merely a military defeat, it was a psychological earthquake. It shattered the assumption, held by many across the world, that the old European order would endure. As the British Expeditionary Force was squeezed into the pocket of Dunkirk, the world watched what appeared to be the final act of British history. Yet the evacuation of 338,000 men, planned in the basement of Dover Castle, preserved the professional core of the British Army. This mattered more than symbolism. It mattered because it preserved capability. Without those men, there would have been no one to defend the island, and certainly no one to lead the eventual liberation of Europe 4 years later. At this point in the war, it is tempting to narrate events as though Britain stood alone in a romantic sense, an island defying a continent. But the more important truth is operational. Britain's survival preserved something that could not be recreated quickly if lost, a functioning state capable of organizing a global war, a functioning navy, a functioning financial system, a functioning industrial base, a functioning intelligence community, a functioning command structure. From this point forward, Britain's role would not simply be to fight, It would be to keep the possibility of victory alive long enough for the coalition to mature. And the first immediate test was in the skies. Following the fall of France, Hitler expected a negotiated peace. He did not account for the stubborn defiance of the British public or the technical foresight of the Royal Air Force. The Battle of Britain is often romanticised as a story of knights of the air, of individual courage in Spitfires and hurricanes. Courage mattered, of course, but the battle was decided less by individual heroism than by the system behind it. Because what Britain built in 1940 was the world's first integrated air defence network, the Dowding system. It was a masterpiece of data management long before anyone used that phrase. Radar, then known as RDF, radio direction finding, was only half the story. The deeper genius was integration, turning raw inputs into actionable decisions. Information from the chain-home radar stations was cross-referenced with reports from the Observer Corps, thousands of civilians with binoculars, then fed into a central hub, where it was filtered, verified, and transformed into clear tracks. This allowed Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding to direct limited squadrons with surgical precision. The RAF did not need to patrol the entire sky. It only needed to be exactly where the German bombers were. That sentence, exactly where the German bombers were, captures something wider than the battle itself. Britain's central wartime gift to the Allied cause was not simply a weapon or a platform. It was a way of thinking, a preference for system over spectacle, for coordination over brute force, for conserving scarce resources by information and organisation. When the Luftwaffe failed to destroy the RAF, it turned its sights on the people. The Blitz, 57 consecutive nights of bombing in London alone, was a test of civic engineering as much as courage. And even here, Britain's response was again systemic. The shadow factory scheme moved industrial capacity into dispersed locations, repurposed quarries, tunnels, and hardened sites. The aim was continuity, production that could not be decapitated in a single strike. And the result is often underappreciated. Despite the bombs, British aircraft production surpassed Germany's in 1940. Britain produced 4,283 fighters, compared to Germany's 3,000. This is not a small fact. It is a strategic fact. It proves that a democracy, under attack, could organise itself more efficiently than a command economy that claimed to embody discipline. But even after the Battle of Britain, even after the Blitz, Britain's survival was not assured, because the decisive battlefield was the Atlantic. If the Battle of Britain was a sprint, the Battle of the Atlantic was a marathon of misery. Winston Churchill later admitted that the only thing that ever truly frightened him during the war was the U-boat peril. This was the longest continuous military campaign of the war, running from the first day to the last. The stakes must be understood plainly. Britain imported roughly 50 million tons of food and raw materials annually. If U-boats sank more ships than Britain could build, the island would starve into submission within months. This was not the cinematic broadside warfare of the Napoleonic era. It was a war of sensors and mathematics. It was also a war of learning. Britain's contribution here is often softened into generalities. Convoys, escorts, anti-submarine warfare. But the truth is sharper. Britain was building the intellectual infrastructure of survival in real time. Technologies such as ASDIC sonar improved detection. The Lee light, a powerful searchlight mounted on aircraft, allowed patrols to spot surfaced U-boats at night and attack them at the moment they believed darkness made them safe. And then there was WW2, the Western Approaches Tactical Unit in Liverpool. Led by Captain Gilbert Roberts and a team of Wrens, women of the Women's Royal Naval Service, WW2 used floor-based wargaming to develop practical convoy manoeuvres, the raspberry and the pineapple, tactics designed to break the logic of the wolf pack and allow convoys to fight back. This matters not just as a technical triumph, but as a corrective to the myth that Britain simply held on until American mass production arrived. These were intellectual breakthroughs that kept the Atlantic lifelines open long before the first American Liberty ship ever set sail. And Britain's Atlantic War did not only sustain Britain, it sustained the Soviet Union too, through one of the most punishing operations of the entire conflict. One of the profound ironies of the war is Britain's role in keeping the Soviet Union alive. After Operation Barbarossa began in June 1941, the USSR was reeling. To prevent a total Soviet collapse, Britain began the Arctic convoys. These sailors faced a dual enemy, the German Navy and the Arctic environment itself. In winter, the sun never rose. In summer, it never set, leaving ships exposed to the possibility of attack around the clock. Temperatures dropped so low that ice built up on the superstructures, making ships dangerously top-heavy. Sailors hacked it away with hammers while under fire from German aircraft. It is difficult to convey this to a modern audience that has grown accustomed to sanitized representations of war. This was misery, exposure, and fear in a landscape that offered no refuge. Between 1941 and 1945, Britain delivered 4 million tons of supplies to the USSR, including thousands of aircraft and tanks. And yet, after the war, Soviet historiography would often claim the victory was achieved single-handedly, as though the Red Army marched from Moscow to Berlin without external lifelines. But history, when examined closely, becomes harder to simplify. At crucial moments during the defense of Moscow and Leningrad, Soviet forces were using British equipment, including Hurricanes, at precisely the time survival hung in the balance. Again, the point is not to diminish Soviet sacrifice. The point is to restore the full architecture of Allied victory. And that architecture included something else that remained hidden for decades: Britain's War of Mines. While soldiers fought in the mud and sailors fought in the spray, a quiet group of minds in Buckinghamshire fought the war with pencil and paper. Bletchley Park, Government Code and Cipher School, was the epicentre of British intelligence. The decryption of Enigma is sometimes told as a story of lone genius, but the reality, as always, is more instructive. It was led by figures such as Alan Turing, but the operation required around 10,000 people, many of them women, working in freezing wooden huts, operating bombe machines, analysing messages, building routines, and maintaining a level of discipline that cannot be romanticised because it was, in practice, monotonous and relentless. The intelligence they produced, codenamed Ultra, gave the Allies something close to a godlike view of the battlefield. Ultra allowed the Royal Navy to know the positions of German supply ships in the Mediterranean, contributing directly to the starvation of Rommel's Afrika Korps of fuel. It allowed British commanders to anticipate Luftwaffe strikes during the Blitz, reducing the enemy's capacity to achieve surprise. And it is no exaggeration to say that Ultra saved Britain from starvation and shortened the war by years. But Ultra's very secrecy created a second war, one fought after 1945. Because under the Official Secrets Act, the people who had done this work went home and told no one, not even their spouses, what they had achieved. Many kept silent until the mid-1970s. This silence became one of the major reasons Britain's intellectual contribution was airbrushed out of early post-war histories. The world cannot remember what it was not allowed to know. And so Britain's war, its most modern war, was pushed into the shadows precisely when global narratives were being written. Meanwhile, the war itself continued, and Britain continued to fight on land, not as a supporting actor, but as a strategic force that struck turning points before others were ready. In 1942, while American divisions were still training and the Soviets were locked in the meat grinder of Stalingrad, British and Commonwealth forces delivered the first major turning point on land, El Alamein. Under Bernard Montgomery, the Eighth Army stopped Rommel, the Desert Fox, and secured what was not merely a battlefield victory but a strategic cornerstone, the Suez Canal and the oil fields of the Middle East. If the Suez had fallen, the British Empire would have been cut in two, and the Axis would have gained a pathway to join forces with Japan in India. This is one of those moments where hindsight can distort reality. Because we know how the war ends, we underestimate the precariousness of the middle years. In 1942, a chain reaction of strategic collapse was still possible. And Britain's role was to prevent that collapse, theatre by theatre, often with limited resources, often under conditions that did not make headlines. Simultaneously, on the other side of the world, Britain fought what you rightly call the Forgotten War in Burma. This was the largest single theatre of the conflict, characterized by jungle rot, malaria, and an enemy that had shattered colonial armies across Asia. The battles of Kohima and Impal in 1944 are sometimes called the Stalingrad of the East. They proved that the Imperial Japanese Army was not invincible, but the deeper significance lies again in systems. General William Slim and the 14th Army, British, Indian, African, executed a masterpiece of logistical improvisation. Entire armies were supplied by air, at a scale the world had never seen. This was not glamour, it was competence, and competence in a global war becomes a form of power. If Britain's war effort is to be understood properly, it must be understood as a portfolio, not one theatre, not one battle, but an integrated effort across sea, air, intelligence, industry, and global coalition. Which brings us to innovation. We often hear about the Manhattan Project. We rarely hear about tube alloys, the British research into nuclear weapons that was later handed to the Americans to ensure its security. This pattern repeats. British invention paired with American production. The jet engine, Frank Whittle's invention, was flight tested in 1941, leading to the Gloucester Meteor, the only Allied jet to see combat. And then there are the innovations that made liberation possible. For D-Day to work, the Allies needed a port. Germany held the major ports, so Britain built its own, the Mulberry Harbours, portable harbours the size of cities, towed across the Channel and sunk into place. It is hard to overstate what this represents. Engineering as strategy, not a supporting detail, but a foundational requirement for keeping armies fed, fueled, and supplied after landing. Then there was Pluto, pipeline under the ocean, fuel delivered through a pipeline laid across the Channel floor to keep the liberating armies moving. Even Britain's bomber force carried innovations of its own. Lancaster aircraft capable of deploying specialized munitions designed to penetrate hardened targets. Again, the thesis is not Britain did everything. The thesis is more precise. Britain provided the framework upon which Allied power could become decisive. And the most overlooked part of that framework is not a machine at all, it is the Commonwealth. One of the greatest injustices of modern revisionism is the erasure of the Commonwealth's role. This was not, in the crude sense, a forced colonial army. It was the largest volunteer force in human history. India alone provided 2.5 million soldiers. They fought in Italy, in Africa, and in Southeast Asia, and were awarded extraordinary numbers of decorations for bravery. Canada provided the bulk of convoy escorts in the North Atlantic and took Juno Beach with an efficiency that rivaled the best of Allied operations. Australia and New Zealand provided the Rats of Tobruk, holding the line when the Blitzkrieg seemed unstoppable. When we talk about Britain in this war, we are talking about a global network of shared sacrifice and shared values, a coalition that became a blueprint for the modern UN and NATO. Yet in popular memory, this network is often depicted as a secondary auxiliary force to the so-called Big Two, This is not merely unfair, it distorts the nature of Allied victory. Because coalition warfare is not simply a matter of who has the most divisions or the most factories. It is a matter of who can integrate people, resources, and strategy across oceans and keep doing so year after year under pressure. By 1944, that integration would culminate in the operation most associated with Allied victory in the West, D-Day. And here again, the popular narrative has narrowed what was, in reality, a British-built architecture. June the 6th, 1944, is frequently portrayed in cinema as a predominantly American event. The American sacrifice at Omaha was extraordinary and deserves its place in history. But the strategic and naval reality of D-Day, the architecture that made the landings possible, was overwhelmingly British. The naval component, Operation Neptune, was led by Admiral Bertram Ramsay. Of nearly 7,000 vessels involved, roughly 80% were British or Canadian. The air cover was provided by the RAF, and of the 5 landing beaches, 3, Gold, Juno, and Sword, were the responsibility of British and Canadian forces. But the most decisive British contribution to D-Day may have occurred before a single soldier landed. It was intelligence and deception, an area where Britain had matured the instruments of modern war. Operation Fortitude, the deception plan that used double-cross agents, German spies turned by MI5, convinced Hitler that the real invasion would come at the Pas de Calais. Even weeks after D-Day, Hitler held back panzer divisions in the north, waiting for an invasion that never existed. Without this British-led deception, the thin Allied line on the beaches may well have been pushed back into the sea. This is the essential correction. Britain did not merely help the liberation. Britain made the liberation operationally possible by providing the staging ground, the command infrastructure, the naval mass, the air cover, the innovations, and the deception architecture that preserved the invasion force during its most vulnerable days. And yet, when the war ended, Britain's position in the global story began to shrink. Not because its wartime contribution had been small, but because the post-war world had changed. How did a nation that fought from day one, broke the enemy's codes, invented the jet engine, and provided the lion's share of the D-Day Navy become a junior partner in the history books? The first reason is economic. By 1945, Britain was a victor, but it was a bankrupt one. To survive the post-war years, it required American financial support, including the Marshall Plan. Being a debtor nation makes it difficult to shout about your own greatness. Diplomatic necessity required Britain to take a back seat to the new American superpower. The second reason is the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union became the new antagonists. In that struggle, both had an interest in promoting their own origin stories. For the Americans, the war was proof of the American way of life. For the Soviets, it was proof of the proletariat's historical mission. Britain's story, steady, quiet endurance, did not fit the binary world order that followed. The third reason is cultural. The 1950s and 60s saw the rise of American cinema as a global cultural hegemon. Hollywood became, in effect, the world's historian. Films cemented American primacy in the public imagination. British war films existed, many of them excellent, but they tended toward the understated and technical, and struggled to compete with widescreen spectacle. Finally, there is the collapse of empire, following Indian independence in 1947 and the Suez Crisis of 1956. Britain was widely seen as a fading power. Historians often project the weakness of the post-war era back onto the war years. They assume that because Britain was weak in 1950, it must have been secondary in 1942. These are not excuses. They are mechanisms. And there is one more mechanism worth stating plainly: silence. Ultra remained hidden for decades. The people who did the work were forbidden to speak. The world therefore learned to attribute outcomes to the visible, armies, factories, flags, while the invisible architecture faded. Britain did not lose the memory of its war by accident. It surrendered it quietly. Why does reclaiming this narrative matter? Because the argument is not about credit. It is about accuracy. If we misunderstand Britain's role in 1939 to 45, we misunderstand how modern coalition war is actually won. We begin to believe victory is produced only by overwhelming scale, by the largest armies, the deepest reserves, the biggest factories. Yet the decisive factor is often the ability to hold the structure together long enough for scale to become usable. Britain's contribution sits precisely there, in the connective tissue of the Allied war effort. It was the functioning base of operations after Western Europe fell, the maritime and logistical platform that kept Britain supplied and kept Soviet resistance materially viable, the intelligence and deception capability that reduced uncertainty and forced German misallocation, the scientific and engineering output that solved problems of landing, supplying, and sustaining an army, and the diplomatic management of a global coalition that could fight in multiple theatres at once. None of this diminishes American production or Soviet sacrifice. It explains how those strengths could be converted into strategic results. American material required secure routes, ports, and an operational staging ground. Soviet endurance, at critical moments, was sustained by external supply. Britain's role was not to replace either partner's contribution, but to make their contributions strategically actionable. There is also a more contemporary reason this matters. The 20th century's major conflicts were not decided by single moments of brilliance. They were decided by systems. How quickly states learned, how effectively they coordinated, how reliably they sustained supply, and how well they integrated intelligence into operational planning. Britain's wartime experience, at its best, offers a case study in that kind of national competence under pressure. As the witnesses to this period pass from living memory into archive and record, the responsibility shifts to us, not to build a comforting myth, but to preserve proportion, to remember that Britain was not simply present at the margins of victory, but central to the conditions that made victory possible. That is what it means to reclaim Britain's war, not a campaign for admiration, but a correction of the lens through which we view the conflict.